I knew something was wrong the moment my phone stayed silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy kind that presses on your chest and refuses to move. I woke up that morning with an ache I couldn't explain, a feeling that something sacred was happening without me, somewhere I wasn't invited to stand. For weeks, I had been waiting for details about my grandchild's baptism. I didn't ask loudly. I didn't push. I trusted that family would remember me. A grandmother doesn't beg to belong. She assumes her place is already there. That trust was my first mistake. I found out by accident, the way unwanted truths often arrive. A neighbor mentioned a celebration at the church. A cousin posted a photo too quickly, too proudly, before remembering to hide it from me. Tiny white candles. Blue ribbons. A smiling priest frozen in a frame that wasn't meant for my eyes. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. This can't be today, I whispered to myself, even as my heart already knew the answer. I scrolled slowly, painfully. There it was. My son's face, glowing with pride. My grandchild wrapped in white. My daughter-in-law standing beside them, serene and composed, as if she hadn't just erased someone from the story. Me. I sat down at the edge of my bed, still in my night clothes, the morning light spilling across the floor like it didn't care who it hurt. The room felt too quiet, as though even the walls were waiting for me to understand. No call. No message. No invitation tucked into an envelope. Nothing. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they forgot. Maybe it was rushed. Maybe someone assumed someone else had told me. Families make mistakes, I said. Families don't mean to wound. But this wound felt deliberate. I replayed every recent conversation in my mind, searching for clues. The short replies. The delayed responses. The way my daughter-in-law's voice had gone flat whenever I mentioned the baby. "We'll let you know," she had said once. They never did. I remembered the day my grandchild was born. How I cried alone in my kitchen, pressing my hands together in prayer. How I bought the little silver bracelet I planned to give at the baptism, engraved with a blessing I'd chosen carefully. It was still sitting in my drawer. I walked to that drawer then, opened it slowly, and held the bracelet in my palm. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried all the love I hadn't been allowed to give yet. I wondered how long they had planned this. Who decided I didn't belong? When my presence became inconvenient instead of comforting. When silence replaced respect. I imagined the empty space beside them in the church pews, the place where I should have been sitting, smiling, whispering prayers for my grandchild's future. That empty space felt louder than any insult they could have spoken, heavier than any harsh word. I reached for my phone again, foolishly hoping someone would realize the mistake and call. I even drafted a message, then erased it. I didn't want to sound desperate. I didn't want to confirm what I was starting to fear. Instead, I waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The photos kept coming. Laughter. Smiling faces I barely recognized. Everyone had a place in that room except me. I felt smaller with every image, as though my role in this family was shrinking into something optional, replaceable, forgettable. Finally, I called my son. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail I barely remember, my voice careful, controlled. I saw the photos. I just wanted to check. Is everything okay? Even as I spoke, I knew the truth was already settled, sealed by silence and distance that day. That silence said everything they refused to say out loud. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was a decision made without me. As the church bells rang somewhere across town, marking a moment I should have been part of, I sat alone and understood something painful and irreversible. I hadn't been overlooked. I'd been left out, without apology, by them. I thought the pain would ease once the truth was spoken, but it didn't. It sharpened instead, cutting deeper the moment I stepped into their living room, carrying hope like a fragile glass I was afraid to drop. I had rehearsed calm sentences on the drive over, promises to myself that I wouldn't accuse or cry. I just wanted to understand. My son barely looked up when I arrived. My daughter-in-law stayed seated, scrolling on her phone, the television murmuring softly behind her like an unwanted witness. The house smelled of coffee and something sweet baking, a cruel reminder that life was going on just fine without me. "I saw the pictures," I said gently. "About the baptism." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. My son shifted in his seat, eyes fixed on the floor. That was when I knew this wasn't a mistake. "We didn't think it was necessary to involve everyone," my daughter-in-law said, finally looking at me. Her voice was smooth, practiced, as if she'd said these words before. Maybe she had. Just not to my face. "I'm not everyone," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. "I'm his grandmother." She sighed, the sound heavy with irritation. This day was about our family. I felt something twist inside my chest. "I am your family." My son cleared his throat then, finally speaking. "Mom, let's not make this bigger than it is." Bigger than it is. As if being erased from a sacred moment was something small. "I wasn't even told," I said. "I found out like a stranger." That's when she leaned forward, folding her arms, her expression firming into something cold and resolved. She looked at me the way someone looks at an inconvenience they've tolerated for too long. "There's no place for you," she said. The words landed hard, echoing in my ears. No place. Not at the church. Not in their plans. Not in their version of family. I waited for my son to object, to soften it, to say something. Anything to undo the damage. He didn't. His silence was louder than her cruelty. I laughed softly then, not because it was funny, but because disbelief needed somewhere to go. "Did I do something?" "Yes." "Did I hurt you without knowing?" He shrugged. "You've always been, a lot." I thought of the nights I stayed awake worrying about my son. The meals I cooked. The money I quietly gave when they were starting out. The love I never rationed. "I've tried to respect your boundaries," I said. "I step back when you ask." "And that's the problem," she replied. "You never know when to stop being involved." My son finally looked up. "Mom, maybe it's best if you give us space." Space. Another word for absence. I felt heat rise to my face, shame flooding every part of me. I wanted to scream, to list every sacrifice, every moment I'd earned my place. Instead I nodded because humiliation has a way of making you small. "So I'm not welcome?" I asked quietly. She didn't hesitate. "Not today." That answer felt final, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. For a moment I considered begging. The thought alone disgusted me. I had carried this family on my back in ways they would never fully know. I had swallowed pride before. I had forgiven sharper words. But this felt different, heavier, as if something sacred had been violated. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. The room seemed brighter now, almost harsh, exposing every wrinkle, every year that made me easy to dismiss. I realized then how clearly they saw me, as something old, inconvenient, easily removed from the picture. At the door I paused, hoping for one last chance. "He'll ask about me one day," I said. "What will you tell him?" Neither of them answered. I stepped outside, the afternoon sun blinding, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and shame. As I walked to my car, I felt something settle in me, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't just exclusion. It was rejection. And as I drove away, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I understood something terrifying. If they could erase me this easily, they might already believe I don't matter at all. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every red light gave my thoughts time to spiral, replaying her words again and again. "No place for you." I wondered when I had lost my place, or if I had ever truly been allowed one at all. By the time I reached my street, my chest ached with a realization I wasn't ready to face yet. The house ahead waited silently, holding answers I didn't yet know I was about to uncover behind doors long kept closed. The church bells rang, and my name wasn't among them. I should have turned around. I knew that. I stood in my hallway that morning, coat in my hands, telling myself this was foolish, humiliating, unnecessary. They didn't want me there. I had heard it clearly enough. There's no place for you. And yet my body moved anyway. I drove to the church on instinct, like muscle memory guiding me somewhere my heart had belonged long before permission was required. The sky was pale and overcast, the kind of gray that presses low and makes everything feel heavier. I parked across the street, far enough that no one would recognize my car, close enough that I could still hear the bells. I told myself I would just sit for a moment. Just breathe. I chose a bench near the side entrance, half hidden by a tree whose leaves were already beginning to fall. From there, I could see the stone walls of the church, solid and unmoved, like they had witnessed 1,000 joys and betrayals and learned not to react. Kept my head down. People began to arrive in clusters, laughing softly, dressed in their Sunday best. Women adjusted each other's collars. Men checked their watches. Children tugged at stiff sleeves. They walked past me without a glance, and for a moment, I was grateful for that invisibility. Then I saw my son. He stepped out of a car, adjusting his jacket, smiling in that familiar way that used to mean safety. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to call his name, to wave, to remind him I was still here. My mouth opened but no sound came out. Behind him, my daughter-in-law appeared, holding the baby. My grandchild. Wrapped in white, peaceful, unaware of the quiet war happening around them. I leaned forward slightly, desperate for a better look, my hands gripping the edge of the bench. My eyes burned not just from tears, but from the effort of staying still. "Look at you," I whispered, barely moving my lips. "You're so beautiful." They disappeared through the church doors, and with them went something fragile inside me. I sat there as the sounds began to leak through the thick walls. The murmur of voices, the scrape of chairs, soft music warming the air. Each sound felt like a reminder that life was continuing just fine without my presence. I closed my eyes, and memories came uninvited. I saw my son as a little boy, clutching my hand on his first day of school, crying so hard his face turned red. I remembered kneeling in front of him, wiping his tears. "I'll be right here," I had promised. "I'm not going anywhere." I remembered nights spent awake, waiting for him to come home, the fear sitting heavy in my stomach until I heard the door. I remembered working extra hours, stretching meals, choosing his needs over my own without ever keeping count. No one ever counts love when they give it freely. A laugh floated through the open church window, light and joyful. Someone clapped softly. I imagined the scene inside, the smiles, the holy water, the moment my grandchild would be blessed. I should have been standing there, hands folded, heart full. Instead, I was outside, pretending not to exist. I wondered if anyone had noticed my absence, if anyone had asked where I was, or if my silence fit so neatly into their plans that it didn't even register. I hugged my coat closer, though the air wasn't cold. Shame has a way of chilling you from the inside. I felt ridiculous sitting there, a grown woman hiding like a child who had been told to stay away. "Why am I doing this?" I whispered to myself. But even as I asked, I knew the answer. Because this mattered. Because they mattered. Because no matter how many doors closed, my heart hadn't learned how to lock itself yet. The church grew quieter for a moment, the kind of hush that signals something important is about to begin. My breath caught. I knew that silence. I had heard it at weddings, funerals, moments when everything changes. Then the priest's voice echoed faintly through the walls, calm and steady. The baptism was starting. I sat frozen, eyes fixed on the door that would not open for me, as the sacred words filled the air. Words meant to welcome, to include, to bless. And for the first time I understood with painful clarity. They had chosen to begin this new chapter of my grandchild's life without me. And I was sitting outside, listening, as if love itself had been placed just out of reach. Everyone was smiling, and none of those smiles were for me. I stayed seated on that bench as more cars pulled up, one after another, like proof that the world inside those walls was expanding while mine was shrinking. Dresses brushed past my knees. Polished shoes clicked on stone. Laughter floated easily through the air, careless and bright. I kept my eyes lowered, but I still saw everything. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years walked in confidently, holding a wrapped gift. A co-worker of my son's arrived with his wife, both of them beaming as if they belonged. Even people I didn't recognize at all stepped through the church doors without hesitation. Strangers had a place. I did not. The music inside grew warmer, fuller, spilling out whenever the door opened. Sounded like celebration, like community, like belonging. Each note pressed against my chest, reminding me of how close I was and how far away I remained. I wondered what excuse they had given for my absence. She couldn't make it. She's busy. She preferred not to come. None of those were true, but lies often sound better when spoken softly. I shifted on the bench, my back stiff, my hands folded in my lap like I was the one waiting to be judged. A woman passing by glanced at me briefly, then looked away, uninterested. To her, I was just another old woman resting outside a church. If only she knew. I caught a glimpse of my son again through the open door. He was laughing with someone, relaxed, at ease. That hurt more than anger would have. He wasn't conflicted. He wasn't struggling. He looked perfectly comfortable in a world where I had been quietly removed. I remembered other moments like this, small enough to ignore at the time. The holidays when plans changed last minute. The dinners where my seat was suddenly gone. The decisions made without my input, then announced as if I should simply accept them. "You understand, right?" my daughter-in-law would say, smiling tightly. I had always nodded. I had always understood. Now I saw the pattern clearly, laid out like a trail I should have followed sooner. This wasn't a sudden decision made around a baptism. It was the result of years of gentle pushing, of making me feel unnecessary, until my absence felt natural, planned. The words sat heavy in my mind. Inside, someone began clapping softly. I imagined the water touching my grandchild's forehead, the blessing spoken aloud. I imagined the photos being taken, the proud smiles, the moment everyone would remember forever. I would not be in those photos. My reflection stared back at me faintly in the glass of the church window. I looked older than I felt. Smaller. Like someone who had waited too long to stand up for herself. I whispered, "You should go." But my feet stayed planted. A familiar voice drifted outside, laughing. It was my sister-in-law. She sounded happy, unburdened. I wondered if she had asked about me, or if she had accepted my absence without question. Most people do. The church doors opened wider then, and a wave of sound rushed out. Applause, murmurs, joy swelling in the space. The ceremony was reaching its heart, and I was still outside, still unseen. My chest tightened, panic rising unexpectedly. I felt foolish, exposed, as if at any moment someone might notice me sitting there and ask the question I wasn't ready to answer. "Why are you out here?" I wouldn't know what to say. I stood up abruptly, my legs trembling. Staying felt unbearable now, like pressing on a bruise to prove it still hurt. I brushed invisible dust from my coat, a meaningless gesture to regain dignity. As I turned away, I caught one last sound from inside, the priest's voice rising, confident and calm. "Today we welcome." I didn't hear the rest. I walked quickly, head down, past the cars and the gifts and the laughter, past the life that had continued without me. Each step felt heavy, final. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry there in public, where my pain would become a spectacle. By the time I reached my car, the music inside had swelled again, joyful and complete. I closed the door gently, like I was afraid of making noise in a world that had already decided I didn't belong. As I drove away, the church shrinking in my rearview mirror, one truth settled deep in my chest, undeniable and sharp. They hadn't forgotten me. They had moved on without me. The front door closed behind me, and the silence swallowed me whole. I stood there longer than necessary, my hand still on the knob, as if part of me expected someone to follow me in and say this had all been a mistake. The house was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Neat, quiet, unmoved, yet it felt different now, like it was holding its breath. I was still dressed for the baptism. My coat hung stiff on my shoulders. My shoes clicked softly against the floor as I walked inside, the sound too loud in a space that hadn't heard my voice all day. I looked ridiculous, dressed for a celebration I had been denied. I set my purse down carefully, the way you do when you're trying to keep control. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time without sympathy. No laughter leaked through these walls. No music. No prayers. Just me. I moved into the living room and sat down slowly, as if my body had aged years in a single afternoon. The couch felt colder than usual. I folded my hands in my lap, staring straight ahead, unsure what to do with myself now that there was nowhere left to go. The insult replayed in my mind, but it wasn't the words that hurt most anymore. It was the emptiness that followed. I turned my head and my eyes landed on the family photos lining the shelf. Frames I had dusted 100 times without really looking. My wedding day. My son as a toddler missing his front teeth. A graduation photo. His arm slung proudly around my shoulders. I reached for one frame and held it close. When did I stop belonging? I whispered. The woman in that photo looked confident, certain of her place. She had believed love was permanent. That if you gave enough of yourself, you earned loyalty in return. I set the frame down gently, afraid it might crack if I wasn't careful. I thought about my son's house, the one they lived in now. How I'd helped with the down payment when they were struggling. How I'd told myself it was an investment in family, not money. You'll always have a place, he had said back then, squeezing my hand. Had he meant it? Or had he said it because it was easy in that moment? I stood and walked slowly through the house, touching familiar surfaces. The dining table where I'd hosted holidays. The hallway where height marks were penciled on the wall as my son grew. Each step brought back memories layered with warmth and quiet sacrifice. No one had ever asked me what it cost. I paused in the bedroom doorway, looking at the bed neatly made, the lamp switched off. This room had held every version of me. Young, tired, hopeful, grieving. It had witnessed promises spoken softly in the dark, plans made for a future that felt secure. I sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled, long and shaky. For the first time since the church, I let myself feel angry. Not loud anger. Not screaming anger. The slow, dangerous kind that arrives with clarity. The kind that asks hard questions. What did they think I was now? A background figure. A wallet. A burden they could ignore until they needed something again. My gaze drifted to the old wooden dresser in the corner. It had been there for decades, its bottom drawer rarely opened. I felt a faint pull in my chest, a memory stirring that I hadn't allowed myself to touch in years. Conversation. Promise. A signature made in trust. I stood again, my movements deliberate now. I knelt in front of the dresser, my knees creaking softly, and rested my hand on the drawer's handle. The wood felt cool, solid, familiar. Inside that drawer were papers I never thought I'd need to remember. Documents tied to my late spouse. Decisions made quietly, responsibly, with the future in mind. Not just theirs but mine. I hesitated. Opening it felt like crossing a line, like admitting something had changed forever. That the family I thought I had no longer existed in the same way. That love alone might not protect me anymore. You never know when to stop being involved, my daughter-in-law's voice echoed in my head. I laughed bitterly. If only she knew how much I had stepped back. How much I had swallowed. I rose from the floor and walked back to the living room, needing one last look at the photos. I studied my son's face in each frame, searching for the boy I raised, the man I trusted. I wondered when he had learned to look past me so easily. Did you think I wouldn't notice? I asked the empty room. No answer came. The house held its silence, patient and heavy. Outside a car passed. Somewhere life continued. Somewhere my grandchild was being celebrated. I returned to the dresser, my resolve settling into something steady. My fingers curled around the handle. I took a breath, deep and controlled, and pulled the drawer open. They never asked me anything, and I let them believe I had nothing worth asking about. The drawer stayed open in front of me, papers neatly stacked, untouched for years. Dust clung to the edges like proof of how long I'd been expected to stay silent. I sat on the floor beside it, the house quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing. All this time they thought they knew me. They thought I was predictable, harmless, a woman who lived off memories and sentiment, with nothing of substance left to offer except unwanted opinions and old stories. They never asked how I managed my money. Never asked what plans I made once my husband passed. Never asked what I wanted. They assumed. And I let them. I picked up the first folder, my fingers steady now. Inside were documents I remembered signing with trembling hands years ago, back when grief was still fresh and promises still mattered. I had made decisions quietly, without announcements or applause. Because that's how I've always lived. I remembered my daughter-in-law's questions over the years, always disguised as casual curiosity. So, do you still own this place outright? Have you ever thought about downsizing? Must be hard to manage all this on your own. Her voice had always sounded polite, but her eyes told a different story. Measuring, calculating, as if she were already rearranging my life in her mind. Had smiled then, changed the subject, pretended not to notice. It was easier that way. I pulled another paper free, scanning the familiar lines. Counts set aside. Conditions clearly written. My grandchildren's names listed carefully, long before anyone thought to include me in their milestones. I had planned for them before they even knew how to plan for themselves. A small laugh escaped me, sharp and humorless. They thought I was powerless, yet they had no idea how much I had protected. How many nights I'd spent thinking about futures that weren't mine anymore. I remembered my son once saying, "You don't need to worry about that stuff now, Mom. We'll handle things." That had been the moment I stopped explaining myself. Because I didn't want to be handled. I wanted to be respected. I leaned back against the dresser, papers resting in my lap. The room felt different now. Not smaller but clearer. Like a fog had lifted. I could see the years laid out plainly. The slow shift from appreciation to entitlement. They never asked what it cost me to help them. They never asked what I gave up. They never asked what I still controlled. My daughter-in-law's voice echoed again in my head, sharper this time. "You've always been a lot." I nodded slowly, alone in the room. It had been a lot. A lot of patience. A lot of generosity. A lot of silence. Too much silence. I stood and placed the documents on the bed, spreading them out carefully. Each page represented a choice I made when no one was watching. A boundary drawn quietly, without confrontation. I thought of the baptism again. The ease with which she'd said, "There's no place for you." As if place was something she could assign. As if value came from proximity, not history. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The same view I'd seen for decades. Children riding bikes. A neighbor watering her plants. Ordinary life unfolding, unaware of the quiet reckoning happening behind these walls. They never asked what I owned because they assumed it would one day be theirs. They never asked what I wanted because they assumed I'd want whatever they decided. They never asked who I was becoming after all the giving, because they didn't think I was still becoming anything at all. I picked up my phone, scrolled through old messages. Short replies from my son. Polite distance from his wife. The gradual cooling that now made sense. Why bother investing emotionally in someone you believe has already given everything they have? I set the phone down without replying to anything. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. Soften. To make things easier for them. Something inside me had shifted, subtle but irreversible. I returned to the bed and gathered the papers, tapping them into a neat stack. My hands didn't shake anymore. I felt grounded, anchored by the truth I'd been carrying alone. "They have no idea," I whispered. No idea how carefully I planned. No idea how deliberately I protected myself. No idea how wrong they were about who held the power now. I slid the documents back into the folder, but I didn't return them to the drawer just yet. I held them a moment longer, feeling their weight, their meaning. All this time, they believed my silence meant surrender. They mistook my restraint for weakness. And as I closed the folder and stood, one clear thought settled in my mind, steady and undeniable. They may have left me out, but they had underestimated me. The truth didn't whisper anymore. It demanded to be spoken. I stood in the center of the bedroom, the folder pressed against my chest, feeling the weight of years settle into my bones. What they thought they knew about my life was a story they had written without me, assuming the ending would favor them. The house creaked softly around me, familiar sounds rising like witnesses. This place wasn't just wood and walls. It was history. It was sacrifice. It was decisions made in grief, not generosity mistaken for permission. They lived comfortably now, believing comfort meant ownership. Never did. After my husband passed, the world slowed in strange ways. People spoke softly around me, careful not to break what they assumed was fragile. But grief sharpened some of us, taught me to read fine print, to ask questions quietly, to protect what mattered without announcing it. The lawyer had looked at me carefully that day. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm very sure." I remembered signing the documents with steady hands, my husband's ring still warm on my finger. We had talked about this, long before illness stole his voice. About fairness. About control. About not letting kindness be exploited. The house was never just theirs. I had allowed them to live there, grow there, build a family there. I believed shared space meant shared respect. Instead, they saw my permission as surrender. My daughter-in-law's words returned, sharper now. "You're lucky we include you at all." Lucky. I laughed aloud at that, the sound bitter and lonely in the room. They thought letting me stay relevant was an act of mercy. They thought proximity replaced gratitude. I moved into the hallway, my fingers brushing the wall where my son's height was once marked in pencil. I had measured his growth here, year after year, never imagining I'd one day measure how far he'd drifted. The baptism exclusion replayed in my mind, clearer now. It wasn't about space in a church. It was about erasure. About rewriting the family narrative until I no longer fit. If I wasn't present at the sacred moments, I would slowly disappear from the important ones too. That was the plan. I sat at the dining table and spread the documents out carefully, like cards in a game no one realized they were playing. Titles, clauses, conditions. My late husband's wishes preserved in ink, immune to manipulation. They assumed love meant access. They assumed silence meant consent. They assumed wrong. I imagined their faces if they knew the truth. The shock. The sudden politeness. The scramble to reframe their words. I felt no joy in that image, only resolve. Kindness, I realized, is often mistaken for weakness by those who benefit from it most. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from my son. "Are you okay?" It read. I stared at the screen, anger flickering briefly before fading into something colder. He hadn't asked where I was. He hadn't defended me. And now, hours later, concern arrived like an afterthought. "I'm fine," I typed, then deleted it. Fine was a lie I was done telling. I thought of all the times I had softened my truth to keep peace. All the moments I swallowed discomfort to avoid conflict. I had believed love required endurance. But love without respect becomes a cage. I gathered the papers into the folder again, my movements deliberate. The house felt steadier now, as if it recognized the shift in me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. The baptism had drawn a line they never expected me to see so clearly. They wanted a future without my presence, but with my contributions intact. That would not happen. I stood, the decision settling firmly in my chest. I would no longer let my silence be mistaken for agreement. I would no longer allow my dignity to be optional. "They don't get to erase me," I said aloud, my voice steady. The house listened. And for the first time since the church bells rang without me, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I was done staying silent. Respect doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes quietly, until one day you realize it's gone. I sat at the dining table long after dusk, the house wrapped in shadows, replaying years of conversations that suddenly made sense. Moments I had brushed aside. Comments I had laughed off. Silences I had filled for them so no one would feel uncomfortable. That's how it starts. Not with cruelty but with comfort. At first, my daughter-in-law had been careful with me. Polite. Almost sweet. She asked for advice she never planned to follow, thanked me for help she expected, smiled just enough to keep things smooth. "You're so kind," she used to say. "You don't mind, do you? We'll handle it from here." Each sentence sounded harmless on its own. Together they were a pattern. I remembered the first time she spoke over me at a family dinner. I had been telling a story about my son as a child, something light, something warm. "That's not how he remembers it," she cut in, laughing. Everyone laughed with her. I smiled too, swallowing the sting. It wasn't worth correcting her, I told myself. It was easier to let it go. That became my habit. Another time, she reorganized my kitchen while visiting. Cabinets rearranged. Items moved. "It just makes more sense this way," she said when I noticed. "You'll get used to it." I told her thank you. I remembered the way she would make decisions, then inform me after. Holidays, schedules, plans involving my own home. "We assumed you wouldn't mind," she'd say. And I didn't mind. Not outwardly. Inside, something shifted each time. Respect had slowly transformed into expectation. Gratitude into entitlement. My generosity became something they counted on, not something they valued. My son followed her lead, often without noticing. He learned the rhythm of her certainty, the way she spoke as if decisions were already settled. "Mom, this is just how things are now," he once told me gently. As if the past could be erased with a word. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair, the wood pressing against my spine. I saw myself nodding again and again over the years, choosing peace over dignity, silence over confrontation. I thought I was being loving. I was being convenient. The baptism was only the loudest example of what had been happening quietly all along. By then, they no longer felt the need to manage my feelings. They felt entitled to my absence. "There's no place for you." Those words didn't come from nowhere. They came from years of learning that I would accept whatever space they assigned me. I stood and walked through the house, the floorboards creaking softly under my steps. Every room held a memory of me accommodating, adjusting, shrinking. I stopped in front of the mirror in the hallway and looked at myself properly for the first time in days. My face looked tired, yes, but not weak. "You taught them this," I said quietly. That truth hurt more than their betrayal. I had taught them that my boundaries were flexible, that my presence was optional, that my feelings would eventually settle if ignored long enough. Entitlement grows best where resistance is absent. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my son. She didn't mean it the way it sounded. "You know how she is." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering. I imagined all the responses I could send. The explanations. The careful wording meant to keep peace. Instead, I set the phone face down. Understanding settled in slowly, like a door closing behind me. This wasn't about convincing them to respect me. It was about showing them what disrespect costs. I returned to the dining table and sat down, the documents still resting nearby, quiet and patient. They had waited years. They could wait a little longer. I took a deep breath, feeling something steady rise inside me. Not rage. Not revenge. Resolve. I would no longer explain myself to people who had stopped listening long ago. I would no longer soften truth to make entitlement comfortable. They believed I would always bend. They were wrong. I reached for my phone again, not to reply, but to open a contact I hadn't called in years. The name sat there, familiar, powerful in its simplicity. The first move doesn't need an audience, I reminded myself. Just needs courage. As my finger hovered over the call button, my heart beat hard, steady, ready. This was the moment everything began to change. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head, and yet nothing prepared me for the quiet tension that filled the room when I finally spoke. The documents were on the table, heavy with years of choices they had assumed I would never assert. I watched my son's hands tremble as he flipped through them, a blush creeping up his neck, his carefully constructed calm beginning to crumble. "Mom, I didn't know," he began, but the words faltered, lost beneath the weight of truth. I shook my head slowly. "Of course you didn't. You never asked." The house was silent except for the soft rustle of paper. Every frame on the walls, every photo I had dusted, seemed to watch, holding judgment patiently. I let them absorb it before speaking again. These were always meant for my grandchildren. I made sure they would be secure, whether anyone appreciated it or not. My daughter-in-law's lips parted slightly, her usual composure slipping. You set this all up?" He nodded. "Yes," quietly, thoughtfully, without needing anyone's approval. Her eyes widened as she realized she had miscalculated entirely. Every assumption she had made about me, every judgment about my supposed weakness, was wrong. You never needed us to handle it," she whispered. "No," I said firmly, leaning forward. "I needed you to respect boundaries I set long ago. But respect was never demanded, only assumed to exist without effort. You mistook my silence for consent, my kindness for weakness." The tension in the room thickened, oppressive, until my son finally found his voice. "Mom, I thought I was protecting you by stepping in." "Protecting?" I echoed, disbelief curling in my throat. "No one needs protection from their own life if you let them live it fully. You assumed convenience over conscience." The words landed like stones, slow and heavy. I saw it in their faces. Shock, guilt, regret, the emotional fallout of underestimating someone they believed powerless. Their roles had reversed, and suddenly, I held a power they hadn't acknowledged before. I paused, letting the silence stretch. The way a storm pauses before breaking. "You've always thought you could measure me," I said softly, almost a whisper. "But you never realized what I was capable of when pushed." I watched as their composure crumbled further. The laughter that once masked judgment was gone. The casual smiles vanished, replaced by something raw and unsettled. They were forced to confront the consequences of assuming the easiest path, the path that ignored honesty, integrity, and respect. My son rubbed his eyes, swallowing hard. I never wanted it to be like this." "No," I agreed, a quiet sting in my own chest. "You wanted it easy, comfortable. And you forgot that comfort doesn't replace responsibility." My daughter-in-law finally spoke again, her tone trembling. I judged you wrong. Thought you were soft, easy. I thought we could outmaneuver you." I allowed a faint smile, not cruel but firm. "You misjudged me. Always. And now you see why assumptions are dangerous." Her eyes flickered to the papers again, then back at me. The realization was settling in, slow, heavy, undeniable. I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by sorrow. It wasn't joy I wanted, it was acknowledgement, and finally I had it. The house seemed to breathe with me, the walls witnessing the shift, the balance tilting after years of quiet endurance. I stayed seated, calm now, letting them process, letting the truth stand unchallenged. The room was still, save for the occasional intake of breath, the shuffle of hands on paper, the quiet realization that they could no longer dictate the narrative without me. And as I looked at my daughter-in-law, her face pale and thoughtful, I knew she finally understood. For the first time she truly saw me. They thought they could erase me. They were wrong. I stood in the living room, the light from the late afternoon sun spilling over the furniture, catching dust motes like little witnesses. My hands were steady, my voice calmer than it had been in years. Not shaking, not pleading, simply clear. "I will not be treated as disposable," I said. The words felt good on my tongue, full of weight and truth. I didn't need to yell. Clarity carries more power than volume ever could. My son looked at me, confusion and lingering guilt in his eyes. "Mom, You listen," I interrupted gently, not harshly. "I have boundaries now, conditions, things that will not be crossed. And I expect them to be respected." My daughter-in-law's expression flickered. Surprise, discomfort, realization. She had assumed I would acquiesce as always. That I would shrink quietly, swallow my hurt, and wait for another chance to love unconditionally. That day at the church, I continued, was a turning point. Not for anger but for understanding. I will no longer allow exclusion to define my place in this family. You can't erase a grandmother. You can't erase me. She opened her mouth, hesitant, searching for a response. Finally she said, I didn't realize. I know, I said softly. You never did. And now you must. I walked to the window and paused, looking out at the street below. Life moved on as it always does, but I was no longer on the sidelines. I had watched the patterns of disrespect for years, but now I had drawn the line clearly. You may not like it, I said, turning back to face them. You may find it inconvenient. But this is non-negotiable. My son swallowed, nodding slowly, understanding settling into his posture. He realized, perhaps too late, that comfort and avoidance do not replace accountability. He had chosen ease over conscience, and now the consequences were tangible. I see now, my daughter-in-law whispered, voice soft but trembling. I misjudged you. I thought you would always step back, always yield. Yes, I said, a bittersweet smile touching my lips. That was the mistake. The room shifted around us. Silence fell, not heavy but thoughtful, like the moment after a storm when the air tastes different, clearer. They were absorbing the truth, and for once, the balance had shifted. I took a deep breath, letting the tension ease slightly. I love this family, I said carefully. But love does not mean submission. Respect is not optional. And I will not sit quietly while my place is questioned or dismissed. There was no argument, no sharp retort. Only acknowledgement, quiet but complete. It was enough. I walked past the dining table, my footsteps deliberate, past the photos that had always reminded me of my role, my responsibility, my love. They seemed smaller now, less like boundaries, more like memories strengthened by the clarity of this moment. You've changed, my son said finally, the words heavy with realization. I have, I admitted. Because silence has limits, and boundaries have to be seen to exist. My daughter-in-law looked down, her fingers twisting nervously. I never understood before. I see it now. I nodded, accepting that recognition as a start. The baptism, the exclusion, the hurt, it no longer held power over me. I could love freely without surrendering my voice. The late sun spilled across the floor, warm and forgiving. I felt my chest lighten, not because the pain vanished, but because it was acknowledged and met with honesty. You cannot erase a grandmother, I said quietly, almost to myself. You cannot erase love, care, or presence that has been given fully. They listened, truly listened for the first time. And I realized something vital. This confrontation, painful and bittersweet, had altered the dynamic forever. Respect was no longer assumed. It was required. And I was ready to claim it, without apology, without compromise. As the room settled into this new balance, I felt a quiet pride, tinged with sorrow, knowing that family would never be quite the same, and neither would I. For the first time in a long while, I was not sidelined. I was seen. I was heard. I was unshakable. I realized that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sitting in the quiet of my home that evening, the sun dipping low through the curtains, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The baptism, the exclusion, the years of subtle disrespect, they no longer defined me. Not because they had apologized, not because they had fully understood, but because I had chosen how to respond. I opened the folder I had been guarding so carefully. My grandchildren's future, the decisions I made quietly, the protections I put in place, they were mine to hold, not theirs to manipulate. That, I decided, was my measure of power. Not anger, not revenge, but foresight. I remembered every time I had swallowed my pride, every time I had softened the truth to keep peace. I could have raged, could have demanded acknowledgement in ways that would have burned bridges. But I chose not to. My silence had been endurance. My actions, deliberate and unseen, had been justice in its quietest form. Sometimes strength is invisible, I whispered to the empty room, letting the words sink into the corners, into the walls that had witnessed every sacrifice, every tear. I thought of my son and daughter-in-law. Their reactions had shifted once they saw my boundaries. They had felt the weight of underestimating me. But I did not need them to suffer. Punishment was not my goal. Respect, clarity, and the protection of what mattered most, that was enough. I walked slowly through the house, touching familiar surfaces. The dining table where birthdays were celebrated, the hallway where my son's growth was marked in pencil, the little nook by the window where I had spent evenings reading to him. They were reminders of what I had chosen to nurture, what I had chosen to leave intact. I sat by the window, looking out as the neighborhood settled into evening calm. I thought about the lessons I wanted my grandchildren to carry, about the legacy I could leave without needing to correct every slight or reclaim every moment. I could let some things fade, not out of weakness but out of wisdom. You can't control everything, I said aloud, though no one answered. And that was fine. I could control my choices, my boundaries, my dignity. That was enough. I remembered the humiliation, the loneliness, the sting of exclusion. And then I let it go, piece by piece, not because it didn't hurt, but because I refused to let it dictate the shape of my life. I chose what mattered: love, protection, foresight, clarity. I smiled faintly, thinking of my grandchildren, of the future I had quietly secured for them. That security, that careful planning was my triumph. Not the arguments, not the confrontation, but the knowledge that I had acted with integrity, with calm, with foresight. My phone lay on the table, silent. Messages unanswered. Conversations left for another time. I didn't need them now. I had done what was necessary, and it was enough. The house was still, filled with shadows stretching across the floor. I could feel every memory in the air. The laughter, the tears, the small victories, the long sacrifices. And for the first time I allowed myself to inhabit the space fully, not as someone waiting to be acknowledged, but as someone who had quietly ensured that what mattered would endure. I closed my eyes and exhaled, a long, slow release. The past would always be part of me, but it no longer held me captive. The betrayal, the exclusion, the subtle erosion of respect, they had taught me, shaped me, strengthened me. And now I was free. Free to love without compromise. Free to act without expectation. Free to define my role not by how I was treated, but by what I chose to protect. I stood and walked to the window one last time, looking out at the soft glow of evening. The sky was a mix of pink and gold, a quiet promise of days to come. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a certainty settle in my chest. Justice, I realized, was not in punishment. It was in peace. And in that understanding I found my closure. I smiled once more, softly, fully, as the house settled around me, quiet and steady. I had chosen wisely. I had chosen dignity. And that was more than enough.